Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but also, as you'll see, at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is made useful not only to the person who has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question is likely to be rather controversial, but nonetheless, never let it be said that Archaeosoup shies away from controversy. The question is very interesting, but the sender has chosen to remain anonymous, and to a certain extent I don't blame them. Dear Mr. Soup, in recent days, you, along with some other archaeology news outlets, have been featuring stories surrounding the seizure of illegally excavated artefacts in Pakistan. This is true. I shall put some links to the stories below. Why is this a bad thing? After all, these 2,000-year-old artefacts were on their way out of a troubled part of the world, northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, and probably headed for Europe, China, or the US. Would these artefacts not be safer in more politically stable environments than a war/insurgent-rich zone? Or at the very least with people who understand their cultural value? I do not mean to offend. This is genuinely a question about the preservation of heritage and artefacts. Thanks for taking the time to answer. Anonymous. Well, yeah, this is very. This is a harsh question. This is really cutting to the nub of certain bones. I suppose the first thing I would have to say is that no, looting and illegal excavation is never a good thing for archaeology, for the history of humanity, or for the preservation of our heritage, artefacts or otherwise. Not least because it is a process which actively divorces the artefact and the object from its source. As Flinders Petrie used to say, museums which were full of unsourced artefacts were charneled houses, that's it, of destroyed evidence. So, in other words, no, looting and illicit activity in terms of archaeology is never a good thing, because it's not really archaeology, it's just plucking shiny things from the ground, or culturally intriguing things from the ground, and hoping that no one will be able to tie them to where they come from. So no, the short answer is no. It's not a good thing. Now, in terms of moving these artefacts to more stable environments, recently in the news there was a story of similar activity happening in Italy. Egypt, of course, not terribly, or rather of late, has been increasingly troubled in terms of its illegal excavations. Pakistan, of course, yes. The UK, even the great America, even the US of A, has trouble with illicit excavation. So, in this respect, actually, unfortunately, the abuse of archaeology and artefacts is actually fairly widespread. For example, if you consider the notion that other countries will treat Afghanistan and its archaeology better than its own people will, all you need to do is look to the story of Mez Anyak, the Buddhist monastery, which has the misfortune to be placed on top of a mountain of copper, which a Chinese organisation, or corporation rather, is wanting to mine. So they're wanting to destroy this monastery. And archaeologists are rushing to try and record it in good time, and ultimately trying to save the monument, because again, this other company from another country has come in and is trashing the place. So the idea that China, Europe or the US will treat these artefacts with more respect than the local people is a bit of a fallacy. Now, it's also worthwhile remembering that it was in fact the Pakistani authorities who halted this illicit exit from the country. Now, the haul, which was recovered by the police, included statues of Buddha, life-sized idols, bronze artefacts, utensils, and decorative plaques. Now, in this instance, we must be very careful not to be imperialist or frankly have a nationalistic bias, or indeed geographical bias, when it comes to our perspective on how people can look after their own heritage. Clearly, the authorities are showing willing here. They did intervene in this instance of illegal trade, and it was halted. Now, as soon as you talk about taking the right away from local people to look after their local heritage, you run a very risky game, or a very risky road. For example, one of the, the Wrath of the Locals, one of the monuments which comes to mind, for me anyway, is Flint Castle in North Wales, just up the road from where I grew up. And there, because of vandalism, spray painting, people drinking on site, smashing bottles, for a little while, Cadw, the Welsh version of English Heritage, or to a certain extent, I suppose, the National Trust, shut down the monument for 6 to 10 days. And locals, far from going, yes, you are protecting it from illicit activity, they actually felt, or some rather, accused Cadw of actively attacking the community. Now, on a broader scale, if you were to say that UNESCO has to go in and somehow try and enforce that these monuments are looked after better than local people can, this may actually incur the wrath of local people. I mean, there are UNESCO monuments which are attacked by locals simply because they are part now of an organisation which is not only foreign but also connected to political and national identities that they want nothing to do with. So again, it's a very risky road that you go down when you start to try and say that local people can't look after their heritage. In the case of Flint Castle, people did step up to the plate, and now the castle is open again to the public. And it sounds as though the Pakistani authorities are doing their very best, and hopefully will continue to do so. Now, it's also worthwhile pointing out that actually there's more evidence of local, or at the very least Afghanistan locals, chipping in or chipping in is a bad turn of phrase to use here, but they're returning to the Bamiyan Buddhas to try and stabilise, if not repair, some of the damage which was done by the Taliban, infamously dynamiting those wonders of the ancient world. Now, they are doing this at great risk to their own personal safety. Archaeologists and masonry workers are stepping up to the plate for their local heritage. So again, this argument that local people should be divorced from that care, I would say, is possibly a flawed one. Now, the other thing as well is that these Buddhas, these statues on the way out of the country, had not exactly been stored well. They were piled on top of each other. Yes, okay, they were in foam in many instances, but what it actually led to was probably more damage. They've been taken apart, chipped up, in order to be packaged and therefore transported out of the country. So again, the idea that people are doing this with the artefact's best interests at heart is also flawed. Now, what I would say is that possibly education might be the key. You're quite right. The local police didn't seem to fully understand the value of what it was that they had, in fact, found or stopped leaving the country. Unfortunately, many, it says here, in one of the articles, many of the artefacts were simply smashed. Some ended up headless, and others lost hands and feet because they were simply piled in the courtyard of the police station in question. But that's not necessarily a fault of local people. You're dealing with often these statues may look rough anyway, so it doesn't let you think, well, it doesn't really matter how I treat them. So in that instance, actually, possibly education at grassroots level in the communities on the borders is well worth it, rather than, as I say, assuming that somehow Europe or China or the US can look after these artefacts better. Indeed, they were on their way to Europe as part of illicit trade. Probably off the back of an illegal shopping list, essentially. Also, I suppose it's finally worthwhile mentioning that at a push, rescue archaeology may be called for in many of these cases. In the case of the Mez Anyak monastery, in the case of these artefacts here from the north of northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, rescue archaeology may be called for. But once again, surely, I would say, most productively, most fruitfully, it would have to be driven by local people, by local archaeologists, by people who actually understand, if nothing else, the landscape and the climate and how best to approach these sites. Rather than, again, just assuming that somehow we have the answer and we'll go in and somehow stop it. Anonymous, I've talked a little bit about these issues. I'm sure many people out there will have thoughts of their own, so please do, as always, feel free to comment below. Please keep the comments clean, because it does sound as though the question was asked in the best possible taste. I don't think he meant any offence. Indeed, he said, "I do not mean rather to offend." This is genuinely a question about the preservation of heritage and artefacts. So please don't get too angry down there. But what I would say is that the question was good, but ultimately the logic was rather flawed. Just think about what would happen if this happened in a quintessential English village, for example. I can't imagine anyone locally responding well to someone in Pakistan saying, "You can't look after that church, we will," and taking the church away, or the monuments therein, or the grave decorations, this kind of thing. So there we go. Once again, thank you very much for asking the question. As I say, keep comments as civil as possible, and let's see what you think out there. Until next time, bye bye.